Hey, everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today,
Mhm.
we're going to be tackling a topic that's not just shaping the 2024 election,
Mhm.
but could actually determine its outcome. It's something called the diploma divide. Now, you probably heard about the urban-rural split
Mhm.
or the red state-blue state divide, but
Mm.
this one's all about the growing gap in political views
Mhm.
between people with a college degree and those without. You might be prepping for a meeting on this, trying to understand the latest polls, or just curious about what's really driving American politics these days. Either way, buckle up because this deep dive is going to be a wild ride.
What's fascinating here is that for decades, we analyze voting patterns based on things like income, race, or where you live. But in recent elections, education level has become this incredibly strong predictor of who you'll vote for.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. I mean, where you went to college,
Yeah,
or even if you went to college, is now a bigger factor than how much money you make. That's a huge shift.
it really is. And we saw it play out in a dramatic way in both 2016 and 2020. Think about the support Trump had among white voters without a college degree, especially in rural areas.
Huh.
That was a key part of his success. And on the flip side, Biden was incredibly strong among college-educated voters,
Yeah.
especially in cities,
And
suburbs.
so it's not just about individual voters, it's literally changing the electoral map.
Right.
We're seeing entire counties and even states flipping
Yeah,
based on how many people have a diploma.
exactly. And that's why understanding this divide isn't just interesting political trivia. It's essential for understanding where American politics is headed.
Okay, so let's break this down. Can you give us a real-world example
Yeah,
of how this divide actually plays out, maybe in terms of specific places or groups?
absolutely. Picture two counties, one rural, one urban. In the rural county, let's say manufacturing jobs have declined, and many folks feel left behind by the economic boom in the big cities. They may be more likely to vote for candidates who promise to bring back those jobs and who speak to their sense of frustration with elites. Now imagine that urban county, where a tech industry is booming and college grads are flocking to high-paying jobs. These voters might prioritize things like climate change action, investment in education, and social justice reforms.
So it's like two completely different worlds, and they're voting accordingly. And this isn't just about economics, right? You mentioned elites. There's a cultural element to this divide, too.
Right, and that's where things get even more complex. Take the idea of woke culture, a term that's thrown around a lot in political discourse these days. For some, it represents a push for inclusivity and social justice. But for others, it's seen as an attack on traditional values or an overreach by liberal institutions.
It's almost like people are speaking different languages, even when they're talking about the same issues. And this difference in perspective, based on education level, is seeping into everything.
Exactly. And it's shaping how both parties approach the electorate. You're going to see them tailoring their campaigns and their messages to try and win over these distinct education blocks.
So how does this actually look in practice? How are Democrats and Republicans trying to appeal to voters on either side of this diploma divide?
Well, Democrats, for example, are really focusing on issues that resonate with college-educated voters, things like climate change, student debt relief, and LGBTQ plus rights. They're advocating for policies like expanding access to affordable health care and making college more affordable.
It makes sense that they'd target those issues.
Yeah.
If they're trying to win over college-educated voters. It's directly relevant to their lives and concerns.
Good.
What about the Republicans? Are they just ignoring those issues altogether?
Not necessarily ignoring, but they're certainly taking a different approach. They're tapping into the anxieties of those who feel left behind by globalization and social change. They're talking about economic patriotism,
Huh?
bringing back manufacturing jobs, and pushing back against what they call woke culture or cancel culture.
It sounds like they're really trying to make a direct appeal to those voters without college degrees, those who may feel like the Democrats aren't listening to their concerns. So both parties are kind of doubling down on their base, playing to their strengths, so to speak. But isn't there a risk in that? Could they alienate potential voters by focusing too narrowly on just one side of this diploma divide?
That's a really important question. And it gets to the heart of the challenge both parties are facing. If Democrats focus too heavily on what some might perceive as elite issues, they risk losing touch with working-class voters, those who might feel like their concerns aren't being addressed. And if Republicans go too far in appealing to a sense of grievance or nostalgia, they could alienate younger voters and those from more diverse backgrounds, especially those with higher levels of education. It's a tightrope walk for both sides.
It sounds like it. Okay, so we've got this major divide in the electorate based on education. and both parties are trying to navigate this tricky landscape. But what are the actual issues where this divide plays out most dramatically? Where do we see those stark differences in opinion?
There are a few key areas where the diploma divide really comes into sharp focus. Let's start with the economy and inflation.
Yeah, I feel like everyone's talking about the economy these days. But are college-educated voters and non-college-educated voters worried about the same things?
Not always. College-educated voters might be more likely to prioritize things like investing in renewable energy and supporting policies that foster innovation and tech growth. They may see those as long-term solutions for a strong economy.
So they're thinking about the big picture, the future. What about those who haven't gone to college? What are their economic priorities?
They're often more concerned with immediate issues, like rising prices at the grocery store and the gas pump. They might want to see policies that bring back manufacturing jobs to their communities, jobs that don't require a college degree. It's a difference in perspective, really. Both groups are feeling the economic squeeze, but they have different ideas about what will fix it.
It makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Your lived experience shapes your priorities. And speaking of different experiences, we've talked about economics, but this divide plays out on social and cultural issues too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Think about hot-button topics like abortion rights, LGBTQ plus rights, gun control. These are areas where education level is often a strong predictor of your stance.
You're right. It feels like these issues are more divisive than ever. And it's hard to even have a conversation about them without things getting heated.
That's because these aren't just policy debates. They're about deeply held values and beliefs. And research suggests that higher levels of education are often correlated with more liberal social views.
So someone with a college degree might be more likely to support, say, stricter gun control laws or expanded access to abortion.
That's the general trend, yes. But of course, there are always exceptions. It's not a perfect predictor. And it's important to remember that within each education block, there's a whole spectrum of opinions and beliefs.
Right. It's not like everyone with a college degree thinks exactly the same way. But it's still a pretty powerful trend.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder if these deep divisions are going to make it even harder to find common ground on these really complex issues.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do we bridge this divide and have productive conversations when our values and perspectives are so different?
It feels like a huge challenge, especially with the 2024 election looming. And speaking of the election, we can't talk about the diploma divide without talking about how it's impacting the race for the White House. I mean, if education level is becoming such a strong predictor of how people vote, that must be having a major impact on the electoral map. Right.
It absolutely is. Remember those key battleground states we talked about earlier? Places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. These are states that were traditionally considered blue wall states, but they've become incredibly competitive in recent elections.
And that shift is at least partly due to the diploma divide.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These states have large populations of white working-class voters without college degrees, a demographic that has shifted toward the Republican Party in recent years. But they also have growing urban and suburban areas with higher concentrations of college-educated voters who tend to lean Democratic.
So it's like these states are microcosms of the national divide, with these two forces pulling in opposite directions. And the outcome in those states could very well determine who wins the presidency.
No doubt about it. And it's not just those Rust Belt states. Think about places like Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina. These are states that are experiencing significant demographic shifts with growing urban populations and an influx of college-educated residents.
So the Democrats are hoping to flip these states by appealing to those college-educated voters, while the Republicans are trying to hold on to their base of non-college-educated voters. It's a real tug of war, and it's playing out in state after state.
That's a great way to put it. And it's going to be fascinating to see how this dynamic plays out in the 2024 election. Because it's not just about who wins the presidency. It's about what this divide tells us about the future of American politics.
Okay, so we've talked about how this divide is impacting the election. But let's bring it back to the listener for a moment. Why should they care about this? What's the so what here?
This isn't just some abstract political theory. It's affecting all of us. The diploma divide is impacting everything from how we consume news, to how we interact with our neighbors, to how we make decisions about our own lives.
So it's not just about politics. It's about how we see the world and how we relate to each other.
Exactly. And it's having very real consequences. It's fueling political polarization, making it harder to find common ground, and contributing to a sense of distrust and division in our society.
It's like we're living in two different realities with different sets of facts and different ways of interpreting the world. And that makes it incredibly challenging to address the complex problems we're facing as a nation.
You hit the nail on the head. We can't even agree on basic facts
Yeah.
or have civil conversations about our differences. How are we going to tackle issues like climate change, economic inequality, or
Right.
healthcare?
It's a daunting thought, isn't it? But knowledge is power, right? The more we understand about this divide,
Yeah.
the better equipped we are to navigate this complex landscape and maybe even find ways to bridge those gaps.
I completely agree. And that's why conversations like this are so important. We need to be aware of this divide, understand its implications, and start thinking about how we can create a more inclusive and productive dialogue across these differences.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about how the diploma divide is playing out geographically, how it's shaping the 2024 election, and why it matters for all of us. But before we wrap up, I want to dig a little deeper into the potential consequences of this trend. I mean, what happens if this divide continues to grow? What does that mean for the future of American democracy?
That's a crucial question, and one that keeps a lot of political scientists up at night. Because if this trend continues unabated, it could have some pretty profound implications. One of the biggest concerns is the potential for increased political polarization.
We're already seeing a lot of that, aren't we?
Yes. And it's only likely to get worse if this divide widens. As people retreat further into their own ideological bubbles, reinforced by their own information sources and social networks, it becomes harder to find common ground or even have civil conversations across the political aisle.
And that makes it incredibly difficult to govern effectively,
Right.
right? I mean, if we can't even agree on basic facts or have productive discussions about policy, how can we address the complex challenges facing our country?
Exactly. And that's not all. This growing divide could also lead to a decline in trust in institutions. If people feel like the government isn't representing their interests or addressing their concerns, they may become disillusioned with the entire political system.
And that's a dangerous path, isn't it? Because when people lose faith in their institutions, they're more likely to be susceptible to misinformation, conspiracy theories, or even extremist ideologies.
That's right. And it creates a vicious cycle. The more distrust there is, the harder it becomes to address the underlying issues. And the divide just keeps growing. It's a scenario that could have serious consequences for the stability and effectiveness of our democracy.
It's almost like this diploma divide is creating a crack in the foundation of our society. And if we don't find a way to repair it, that crack could become a chasm.
That's a powerful analogy, and I think it captures the urgency of the situation. We need to find ways to bridge this divide, to start having more constructive conversations across these differences, and to rebuild trust in our institutions.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the potential downsides, the risks if this divide keeps growing. But is there any reason for optimism? Are there any signs that maybe we can overcome this?
Well, I wouldn't say it's all doom and gloom. There are people and organizations working hard to bridge this divide. There are initiatives focused on promoting media literacy, fostering civil discourse, and finding common ground on issues that transcend political affiliations.
So there are people out there trying to build bridges to connect those different realities we talked about earlier. Are there any specific examples you can share, maybe something our listeners could get involved with?
Absolutely. There are groups like the National Institute for Civil Discourse, which works to promote constructive dialogue and reduce political polarization. There are also organizations like Braver Angels, which brings together people from across the political spectrum for workshops and discussions aimed at finding common ground.
These are great resources, and I think it's important for all of us to remember that even though we might disagree on certain issues, we all share a common goal. A healthy, functioning democracy where everyone feels heard and represented.
I couldn't agree more. And I think it's also worth noting that the American electorate is not static. People's views evolve over time, demographics are shifting, and new issues emerge that can reshape the political landscape.
So maybe this diploma divide isn't a permanent fixture. Maybe it's just a snapshot of where we are right now, a reflection of the anxieties and uncertainties of our time.
That's certainly possible. And it's up to all of us to decide what kind of future we want to create. Do we want to continue down this path of division and polarization, or do we want to find ways to come together, bridge our differences, and build a more united and prosperous nation?
It's a choice we all have to make, individually and collectively. And that brings us back to you, our listeners. We've thrown a lot of information at you today, but we want to leave you with something to think about. As you watch the 2024 election unfold, as you see those campaign ads and hear those sound bites, ask yourself, how is this diploma divide playing out? Are the candidates trying to bridge the gap? Or are they exploiting it for political gain? And what role can you play in fostering a more constructive and inclusive dialogue?
These are the questions we all need to be grappling with, because the future of our democracy may very well depend on our ability to answer them.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the diploma divide. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, maybe even a little bit inspiring. Remember, knowledge is power, and understanding these complex dynamics is the first step towards creating a better future. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.